Western approach was essentially an approach of proselytizing religiously, but also an approach whose objective was economic domination and to some, largely plunder, actually, if we want to speak things, frankly. But Belt and Road Initiative, in principle, I think actually I'm very much in favor of it. The idea, I think, is the basic idea of integrating the entire Euro-Asian space. Think of the fact that actually many of these countries are countries with fairly old history, like to take Uzbekistan, for example, and being integrated into this large space and trading with both Russia and China and Iran and the Middle East and of course India would actually really make that area, and particularly Asia, become to some extent economically, I think, the center of the world. Now, the part of Belt and Road Initiative, which attracts lots of attention, is also having to do with Africa. There, the Chinese are criticized for doing the projects basically using only their own technology, manpower, and so on. Well, that, according to the studies that have been done, is not exactly true. Actually, the involvement of people from the countries where the projects are being taken is quite significant in terms of work and labor, even engineering. The story about that trap, that basically you borrow so much and you're then unable to repay, and then the Chinese take over different places things that belong to you. I think it's overdone, because if the debt was such a big issue, it wouldn't be a big issue not only with China, it could be a big issue with any country. So I think it is overdone, and I actually believe that the Chinese approach, which goes after infrastructural projects, replicates what turned out to be successful in China. In other words, unless you have good infrastructure, you really cannot have economic growth. You cannot attract foreign investors. You cannot actually have people come there and participate in economic activity. So China, in that sense, is actually trying to replicate in Africa what was successful at home. So I think actually one should support that rather than permanently claim that they're negative sides. And I think the integration of Africa is a little bit like what I was saying before for the Eurasian continent. This is actually thinking in a grand scale of things. And what I actually like about the Chinese approach oftentimes is that actually it is able to think about the grander scale of things. So we don't simply do small projects. We actually try to think of the projects that would actually have a huge advantage in bringing into the sort of market economy production large parts of the world. Now, let's go look at Africa. Africa is actually the only continent with significant and actually very significant increase in population. So African importance will definitely increase in the 21st century. But what is also crucial for Africa is that it starts catching up on a per capita terms with other parts of the world and rich countries. So if one doesn't do anything and just believes, as many international organizations believe, that Africa is going to grow simply because you organize, transparency projects, you organize NGOs, you organize conferences in nice cities, I don't think it's going to work. And actually we have seen that it basically doesn't work. You need more than that, and you need actually some real investments. You need to go back to what the West was doing actually in the 60s and the 70s, is building things that are actually physical things and that are useful. And certainly roads are useful, and even if some of them are not profitable. We know, for example, for China, the fast trains are not profitable in the simply generating income. We know that for Spain. Spain had a very good system of railroads, of fast trains, and they're also losing money. But the externalities that are provided, and of course the economists have been talking about that for years, by that integration are huge. So they cannot be captured by the train itself, because if you put the price of the train so high that nobody, of course, are going to use the train to ship the goods. But the trains are going to be a loss-making enterprise. But they would actually contribute, when I say trains, I mean also the roads and the infrastructural projects, they would contribute a lot. It seems to me that on balance, these are really good ideas. There are two things which I really think, it seems to me, crucial. One is working on actual project, physical projects, rather than working on changes in regulation, government structure, and this kind of soft area. So actually the project objective is, as we were saying before, to build a road, not necessarily to change the taxation system. That's the difference. So the emphasis from the Chinese perspective is on the hard projects. Well, that was, as I mentioned before, it was something that the World Bank, for example, has been doing in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. The emphasis was on the hard projects. The emphasis was not on changing the incentives or the instruments that the government was using. That started with structural adjustment lending, where actually the balance changed from working on hard projects to working on so-called soft changes in policy. So that's one first difference between what China seems to be doing now compared to what international financial institutions are doing. The second big difference, which is somewhat related to the first, is that China officially does not want to interfere in policies of those countries. Again, this is not something that China has invented. If you go back again to what international financial institutions did in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, they didn't interfere in political space very much because they wanted to keep economics separate from politics so that they don't actually sort of scare many of the African countries that were non-aligned, or some of them were close politically to the Soviet Union. And so the basic story then is the difference between Chinese approach and the Western approach today is twofold. First, emphasis on hard projects versus soft projects, and non-interference versus interference. What I wanted to mention and to explain is that these two parts of the Chinese approach, hard projects plus non-interference, were something that the West did in the past as well. So it is not something that neither China invented, nor is it something that we have to criticize China for as if the West had never done it. So it is simply going back to the older approach, and in some respects that approach might have been even better than the more recent approach of political interference with policy sort of dialogue or policy demands that are often made out of countries that borrow.